Picture this. You're standing inside a foreign governor's hall, far from the olive groves and stone temples you call home. The air smells like wax, dust, and ink. A seal royal, heavy, hangs from a document that is not negotiable. You don't debate it, you listen. Outside, the sea is still full of ships, and the roads are still full of men with weapons, but the war is no longer decided by spear points, it is decided by paper. A herald reads the terms. They sound like peace. They sound like freedom. They sound like every city standing alone, proud and untouched. And then the blade turns in the sentence. The Greek cities of Asia, Greek cities, are handed to the king of Persia. Not conquered today, signed away. And the power chosen to enforce the independence of the rest is Sparta. You feel the room tighten. This isn't a treaty between equals. This is an order, and you already know what comes next. Sparta will call it stability. Its enemies will call it betrayal. The victims will call it survival, if they live long enough to name it. Xenophon, Hellenica. The king's peace, also called the Peace of Antalcidas, is often summarized in a clean sentence. It ended the Corinthian War. But the historical reality is uglier and more structural than that. Because this peace did not simply stop fighting, it redefined who had the right to decide Greek politics. In the 5th century, Greeks built an identity around resisting Persian power. In the 4th, the same Greek world watched one of its strongest states help Persia dictate the settlement of Greek affairs, not by invasion, by diplomacy. And the instrument was a word that sounded harmless: autonomy, the independence of each polis. This isn't the heroic story of Greeks united against barbarians. This is a story of Greek fragmentation, exploited by Persian strategy, and of Sparta choosing a deal that secured its dominance in Greece while sacrificing Greek cities in Asia. The most widely accepted interpretation is not that Sparta suddenly became pro-Persian, but that it pursued a hard calculation: preserve Spartan hegemony at home, even if that meant accepting Persian sovereignty in the east. Encyclopedia Iranica. And this is where myths need to die. This isn't Sparta, the noble defender of Greece. This is Sparta as a state under pressure, with declining manpower and a permanent need to control allies who increasingly hate it. This isn't Persia as a blunt invader. This is Persia as an empire that understands leverage, that can buy fleets, shift alliances, and impose order without marching an army to Athens. And this isn't peace. This is a reset of the map, enforced by a Greek spear, Spartan at Persian direction. We're going to walk through how that happened: the terrain, the logistics, the naval reality, the morale crisis, and the political traps. And we're going to keep the human cost in view, because autonomy on paper often meant garrisons, coups, exiles, and starvation in real streets. Cambridge Core Quell, the King's Peace. To understand the King's Peace, you have to start with the world after 404 BCE. Athens is defeated, its walls are torn down. Sparta stands at the center of Greek power, but Sparta is not built like Athens. It is a land power with a rigid social structure and limited citizen manpower. It can win battles, it can intimidate. But maintaining a wide empire is a different kind of war, a war of money, ships, garrisons, and politics. And Sparta makes a decision that will poison everything that follows. It cuts deals in the Persian sphere. That is not a moral judgment, it is a strategic fact. Greek city-states in Asia Minor, the Ionian cities, become bargaining chips between Greek powers and Persia, and decides on the peace with Sparta. Persia, meanwhile, is not the Persia of 480. It is still enormous, but it is managing frontiers and rebellions. Artaxerxes II, reigning roughly 405–4359–8, has a long-term problem. Greek warfare keeps spilling into western Anatolia and the Aegean, destabilizing satrapies and coastal control. Persia doesn't need to conquer mainland Greece. It needs Greeks to stop interfering in Persian Asia, and it needs Greek states divided enough to prevent a unified threat. Encyclopedia Iranica. Then comes the Corinthian War, 395–387–6. Sparta faces a coalition: Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, and others, with Persian money appearing on different sides at different times. The details of the war's shifting alliances matter less than the pattern. Persia funds Greeks against Greeks when it suits Persian interest, and withdraws support when the Greek recipient becomes too successful. Diodorus Siculus, Library of History, a key shock is naval. Sparta cannot reliably dominate the sea. Persian resources and experienced Greek commanders can remake the naval balance. Diodorus describes a Persian fleet operation under the satrap Pharnabazus and the Athenian Conon, culminating in a decisive blow at Cnidus 394 BCE, after which Sparta lost the sovereignty of the sea in the narrative tradition. Even if later historians debate exact emphases, the strategic meaning is clear. Spartan naval power breaks, and with it the ability to control the Aegean coastline by force. Diodorus Siculus now take that naval reality and combine it with land warfare around Corinth. The Isthmus becomes a meat grinder of raids, fortifications, and ambushes. Battles are not always decisive, but they grind resources, men killed, crops burned, trade disrupted. Greek warfare here is not glamorous, often it is attrition in narrow corridors, fought around walls and ports. Diodorus's description of fighting around Lycaeum and the Isthmian zone underscores how central Corinth becomes to the conflict's name and logic. Diodorus Siculus, and over this entire landscape Persia watches. The longer Greeks bleed each other, the more manageable Greece becomes. But Greece isn't a passive victim. Greek states are making choices, often brutally rational. Athens wants to rebuild power. Thebes wants regional control in Boeotia. Corinth and Argos want security and influence. Sparta wants to keep its hegemony from collapsing. This is not a war of ideals. This is a war of survival for regimes. And the king's peace will not end that logic. It will formalize it. The tactical setup of the king's peace begins with a problem. Sparta can't win cleanly. On land, Spartan hoplites remain dangerous. On the sea, Sparta has been wounded. And inside Greek politics, Sparta's reputation for harsh dominance, its willingness to impose oligarchies and garrisons, creates permanent resistance. Sparta's answer is to change the theatre. If you can't force your enemies into submission on the battlefield, you force them into submission with diplomacy backed by someone else's power. In this case, Persian power. This is where the Spartan diplomat Antalcidas enters the story. Plutarch, writing later, frames Antalcidas in explicitly moral language, claiming he induced the Lacedaemonians to surrender Greek cities in Asia to the Persian king and thereby produce the famous peace. Plutarch's moral framing is not neutral, and modern historians treat him cautiously. But his testimony is important because it shows how later Greek memory judged the settlement, as disgraceful, as submission, as a turning of Greek against Greek under Persian authority. Plutarch, Artaxerxes. Xenophon, by contrast, preserves the core text of the settlement as a royal rescript, introduced with a scene. Tiribazus, a Persian satrap, summons those who want to hear the peace the king had sent down, displays the royal seal, and has the writing read aloud. The tone is critical. The treaty is not negotiated, it is delivered. Xenophon, Hellenica, the rescript, in Xenophon's version, does three foundational things. It asserts Persian sovereignty over the Greek cities in Asia, an explicit reversal of the earlier liberation narrative that Greeks used after the 5th century. It assigns certain islands, Lemnos, Imbros, and Syros, to Athens as exceptions. It declares that the other Greek cities, small and great, are to be autonomous. Xenophon, Hellenica. That autonomy clause is the hinge. It sounds like freedom, but autonomy in Greek interstate politics becomes a weapon. If every city must be independent, then leagues and federations like Thebes' dominance in Boeotia become illegal under the peace. The clause can be used to break coalitions, isolate cities, and justify intervention. This isn't freedom, this is atomization, and Sparta positions itself as the enforcer. Xenophon's narrative makes it clear that Sparta uses the peace to force compliance. The most notorious immediate flashpoint is the Theban attempt to sign on behalf of the Boeotians, which Agesilaus blocks, insisting the Thebans sign only for Thebes, not for a Boeotian confederation. Sources differ on precise diplomatic mechanics, and scholarship debates exactly what was sworn and in what capacity, but the political consequence is clear. Boeotia's unity is challenged under the banner of autonomy. Cambridge Core, Corkwell. This is the setup. Sparta, unable to dominate the sea and facing coalition pressure, invites Persia to dictate the peace, and then uses that peace to destroy the political structures of its enemies. The escalation is not a single turning point. It's a chain of pressure decisions, each one narrowing the options until the king's peace becomes the least awful choice for enough states. Turning point 1. Persia's leverage becomes decisive. Diodorus presents Persian involvement through satraps and money as a recurring force in the period. Conon, operating as an Athenian but commanding Persian resources, rebuilds Athenian walls with Persian support, an outcome that would have been impossible if Persia remained a consistent Spartan ally. The simple reality is, Persia can fund fleets and cities, and in a Greek world without a unified treasury, money is strategic terrain. Diodorus Siculus, but Persia's objective is not Athenian revival. Persia is not sentimental. It wants Greeks fighting each other, not building a new empire in the Aegean. So Persia changes posture when necessary, shifting support. Turning point 2. Diplomacy becomes a battlefield. The peace process itself becomes its own war. Xenophon gives the strongest documentary feel. Envoys gather, a Persian official reads a royal decree, and compliance is demanded. This is where the Greek world is psychologically forced into a new reality. The great king is again acting as an arbiter of Greek affairs, not an external enemy. Xenophon. Hellenica modern scholarship warns that Xenophon's account is selective and shaped by his political perspective, and that we cannot recover every clause or negotiation step with certainty. But that uncertainty does not erase the core. It makes it more chilling. We know the effect even when the paperwork is incomplete. Cambridge core, Corkwell. Turning point 3. Sparta chooses enforcement power over Panhellenic legitimacy. Here's the central betrayal claim. Sparta chooses a peace that restores Persian sovereignty over Greek communities in Asia. That is not a later interpretation, it is built into the rescript's wording as Xenophon preserves it. Xenophon Hellenica. Plutarch's later narrative emphasizes the shame. Antalcidas, acting in the interests of the king, persuades Sparta into surrendering Greek cities. You should read Plutarch as moral memory, useful, but not a verbatim record. Still, the alignment is clear. The peace is widely remembered as a Spartan-Persian arrangement at the expense of other Greeks. Plutarch, Artaxerxes. This isn't Sparta lost its values. This is Sparta recognizing that legitimacy doesn't feed garrisons. This isn't Persia conquered Greece. This is Persia recognizing that Greek unity is the only real threat, so Persia rewards the state that keeps Greece divided. Encyclopedia Iranica, turning point 4. The autonomy clause becomes a scalpel. Corkwell highlights the interpretive minefield. What exactly did autonomy mean in the king's decree? Did it imply a ban on garrisons? Did it forbid leagues? Did it merely assert non-domination in theory while permitting enforcement in practice? We do not have the full stone text. That's not a small problem, it's the core problem. And it matters because Sparta will use autonomy to justify breaking rival structures while maintaining its own influence. Cambridge core, Corkwell. So the escalation becomes psychological. Each city has to decide, do we keep fighting and risk destruction? Or do we accept a peace whose hidden cost is that we will stand alone, easy prey for Sparta's enforcement? The fear isn't theoretical. Greek police know what happens after defeat. Exiles, executions, confiscations, imposed constitutions. The war's politics have already shown that internal enemies are often treated as more dangerous than foreign ones. Diodorus's description of civic violence and factional slaughter in this era reinforces that Greek warfare is often civil war by proxy. Diodorus Siculus. This is where the king's peace gains traction, not because it is just, because it is a way out for exhausted states, and Sparta is willing to pay the moral cost, because the peace gives Sparta a legal language to do what it already wants: break rival coalitions, isolate enemies, and police Greece. This isn't compromise. This is restructuring. Wars like the Corinthian War are remembered through names and treaties. But the war is lived through hunger, disease, displacement, and fear. Diodorus describes repeated campaigns of ravaging, armies moving through farmland, cutting orchards, burning villages, taking slaves and loot. These aren't just tactical actions, they are economic strangulation. An army that lives off the land is eating the future. Diodorus Siculus. When armies concentrate around choke points like the Isthmus, civilians become trapped between walls. Ports like Lycaeum become magnets for raids and counter-raids. Every movement risks ambush, every harvest risks being burned. Inside cities, political terror grows. Diodorus describes episodes of factional violence, killings in public spaces, exiles, confiscations. Even if individual numbers are debated by historians, the pattern is verified. Civil conflict and war feed each other. Diodorus Siculus, the peace that comes later, will not heal that. It will often intensify it, because an autonomy clause can be interpreted as permission to dismantle federations and impose new political arrangements, often with Spartan pressure behind it. And for the Greek cities in Asia Minor, the human cost is existential. Xenophon's text makes the transfer explicit. The cities in Asia are to belong to the king. That means their political disputes, their tribute, their security, their autonomy, everything now sits under Persian imperial authority. Some Greek cities had lived under Persian power before. Some had rebelled. Some had shifted allegiance repeatedly. But the peace formalizes their subordination at a moment when many Greeks still carried the memory of freedom from Persia as a defining story. Xenophon, Hellenica. This is why later Greek memory calls it betrayal, not because it was uniquely cruel in a cruel era, but because it inverted a central identity myth. This isn't a battlefield massacre you can point to. This is a mass political dispossession. And those are harder to mourn, because there is no single day of blood to mark the loss. There is only a document read aloud under a royal seal. To understand how the king's peace works tactically, you have to see it as a combined arms system. Only the arms are diplomacy, fleets, and enforcement. The Persian instrument, the royal rescript, Xenophon's account is structured like a command. Tiribazes displays the seal, reads the decree, and frames it as an order from Artaxerxes. The threat is explicit: accept these terms or face war. Even if Xenophon's phrasing is not a full transcript of Persian diplomatic style, the power dynamic is accurate. Persia is dictating the framework. Xenophon, Hellenica. Encyclopedia Iranica confirms the core terms and emphasizes the strategic outcome. Persian power in Asia Minor is secured, and Persian influence inside Greece is established. Encyclopedia Iranica. The Spartan instrument, enforcement under autonomy. Sparta's genius here is not moral. It's administrative. If you can claim that you're enforcing autonomy, you can intervene against leagues and federations while pretending you are defending freedom. Corkwell highlights that we are uncertain about the full wording and implications of autonomy. This matters because it gives Sparta interpretive space. If the peace says all cities, small and great, are autonomous, then Sparta can demand that a regional power stop speaking for others. That cuts coalitions into pieces. It turns diplomacy into siegecraft. Cambridge Core, Corkwell. This is where the Thebes issue becomes critical. Thebes wants to sign for Boeotia. Agesilaus refuses. The dispute is not only about who signs. It's about who, thinking and acting as a unit, is allowed to exist. The autonomy clause becomes a legal weapon to break the Boeotian League's coherence. Scholarship debates details, but the consequence is consistent across interpretations. Theban regional authority is targeted. Cambridge Core, Corkwell, the naval instrument. Control of the Aegean's pressure points. Why could Sparta even promise enforcement? Because Persia can threaten the sea. The Aegean is not a single battlefield. It is a chain of supply lines. Whoever controls maritime movement controls grain routes, mercenary transport, and the ability to reinforce allies quickly. Diodorus's narrative of Persian fleet operations under Conon and Pharnabazus shows that Persia can build, supply, and deploy fleets at scale, something no single Greek polis can match consistently in this period. Diodorus, Siculus. Sparta doesn't need to be the strongest navy if Persia is willing to pressure the seaways and Sparta is willing to apply pressure on land. It becomes a division of labor. Persia provides strategic weight and the threat of wider war. Sparta provides local enforcement and intimidation. The psychological instrument, isolation, the autonomy clause, turns every city into a lonely target. A league can pool manpower and resources. A single polis cannot. In a Greece full of raids and sudden coups, isolation is vulnerability. This isn't peacekeeping, this is disarmament by fragmentation. And it is why the king's peace is so effective and so hated. It turns Greek political structure into something Persia can manage and Sparta can dominate. The climax is not a cavalry charge, It is the moment Greece accepts a new order. Xenophon gives you the scene. The peace is read. The seal is shown. The language is final. The Greek delegations are not negotiating. They are responding to a decree. Xenophon Hellenica. Now watch the logic lock into place. The Greek cities in Asia are declared Persian. That is the first cut. The islands of Clazomene and Cyprus are included in the king's claims in Xenophon's text. That is the second cut. Athens is allowed to keep Lemnos, Imbros, and Syros. That is not generosity. That is a bribe aimed at breaking coalition resistance. It gives Athens something concrete, while it loses the larger ideological battle. Xenophon, Hellenica. Then comes autonomy. Small and great, autonomous. And people hear what they want to hear. They hear no more Spartan garrisons. They hear no more Theban dominance. They hear no more Athenian empire. They hear each city protected. But the same clause can mean the opposite, because enforcement belongs to the strongest. Autonomy becomes a justification to dismantle rivals, not a shield against power. This isn't peace as reconciliation. This is peace as a legal framework for coercion. And the greatest cruelty of it is that it looks clean. It looks like a treaty. It looks like order returning. Plutarch's later moral framing cuts through the illusion. He portrays Antalcidas as acting for the king's interest and describes the surrender of Greek cities as shameful. Again, Plutarch is late and moralizing, but he reflects a persistent Greek judgment. Sparta did not merely accept Persian terms, it helped deliver them. Plutarch, Artaxerxes, and Persia, Artaxerxes II, wins without invading. Iranica emphasizes the strategic success. Persian power in Asia Minor is secured, and Persian influence inside Greece is reinforced. Encyclopedia Iranica, the war ends, but the map of Greek politics is now written under Persian authority. And Sparta steps forward, not as a liberator, but as an enforcer. This isn't Sparta conquering Greece. This is Sparta policing Greece. This isn't Persia returning as an invader. This is Persia returning as an arbiter. This isn't Greek unity. This is Greek survival through submission and fragmentation. And once you accept that, the betrayal is no longer a dramatic twist. It is a structural decision made by a state that believes dominance is worth any price. The immediate aftermath is deceptively quiet. Wars end, and people imagine relief. But the king's peace creates a battlefield of enforcement. Sparta has a diplomatic weapon. It can claim that any federation or hegemonic arrangement violates autonomy. Thebes' position in Boeotia becomes a primary target. Scholarship debates exact procedures and the degree to which Xenophon's framing distorts detail, but the enforcement trend is widely recognized. Sparta uses the peace to break enemy structures and preserve its hegemony. Cambridge Core, Corkwell. Athens is partially rehabilitated, allowed to keep specific islands, and, in the broader narrative tradition, rebuild infrastructure. Yet it does so in a world where autonomy is now the official ideology. That ideology can later be used against Athens as well. In other words, Athens receives tactical oxygen but inhales a political poison. A peace framework designed to prevent the re-emergence of large-scale Greek coalitions. Xenophon, Hellenica. For the Greek cities of Asia Minor, the aftermath is blunt. They are back under Persian sovereignty by formal declaration. Iranica states this clearly as the peace's central Persian victory, Encyclopedia Iranica. And for Sparta, the aftermath is a temporary high, an enforcement hegemony that looks stable, but it carries poison too. The more Sparta enforces autonomy, the more it proves that autonomy is rhetoric. The credibility gap grows, resentment deepens. And the very political fragmentation Sparta imposes will eventually make collective resistance harder until a new kind of military innovation, led by Thebes, breaks Spartan field dominance later in the century. The king's peace ends a war. It also plants the seeds for new wars, because it does not resolve the competition for leadership. It merely shifts the rules so that Persia has a thumb on the scale and Sparta holds the hammer. The legacy of the king's peace is not a moral lesson, it is a strategic one. It shows that Greek autonomy can be weaponized. A principle that sounds like freedom can be used to destroy collective security. Corkwell's discussion makes clear that our uncertainty about the exact text and its implications is part of the historical problem. The peace's power lies not only in what it explicitly says, but in what it allows powerful actors to claim it says. Cambridge Core, Corkwell. It also shows Persian statecraft in the 4th century. Persia does not need to invade Greece. It needs to ensure that Greek states cannot unify against Persian interests in Asia. Iranica's summary emphasizes that the peace secures Persian control in Asia Minor and establishes influence in Greece itself. Encyclopedia Iranica, and it shows the limits of Spartan power. Sparta's dominance after 404 is real, but it is not endlessly sustainable. The state's need to enforce compliance is a sign of insecurity. A confident hegemon doesn't need constant coercion. A vulnerable one does. This isn't Sparta at its strongest. This is Sparta managing decline through control. This isn't Persia rising through war. This is Persia winning through policy. And this isn't Greek history turning on a single betrayal. This is Greek history revealing a hard truth. The most dangerous threat to Greek independence is often not a foreign army. It is Greek rivalry exploited by outsiders who understand systems better than slogans. The king's peace forces an uncomfortable question. If you are Sparta surrounded by rivals, short on manpower, trying to hold an empire you are not structurally built to sustain, what is the price you are willing to pay to stay dominant? And if you are a Greek city in Asia, signed away on a decree read under a foreign seal, what does Greek freedom even mean when other Greeks decide your fate? This isn't a story where villains wear one uniform and heroes wear another. This is a story where competence and cruelty sit in the same hands, and the question that remains is not whether Sparta betrayed Greece. The harder question is whether the Greek world, fractured into jealous cities, made betrayal inevitable.